There is a city in Belgium where the Middle Ages never quite ended. Not because anyone planned it that way. Not because a king issued a decree or a government passed a law, but because one morning, sometime in the 15th century, the merchants of one of the most powerful trading cities in northern Europe woke up and realized the water was gone. The harbour had silted up, the channel that connected Bruges to the North Sea, the channel that had carried the wealth of northern European trade into this small Flemish city for 200 years, had quietly, gradually, irreversibly filled with sand and sediment. The ships stopped coming. The bankers packed their ledgers and moved to Antwerp. The great merchant houses closed their doors. The money left, and because the money left, no one ever tore the city down. Many other medieval cities in northern Europe burned, rebuilt, modernized, demolished their old centres to make room for something new. Bruges did not. The canals are still where they were in the year 1300. The guild houses are still standing. The market square still looks, in its essential shape, exactly as it looked when Flemish merchants were negotiating deals that moved goods from the Baltic Sea to the coast of England. What you are about to hear is not a simple story of preservation. It is something stranger and more interesting than that. It is the story of how a city became one of the great commercial centres of the medieval world, and what happened when that world moved on without it. It is the story of painters and plague, of weavers who defeated knights in open battle, of a harbour that betrayed the city it had built, and of 300 years of silence that turned out to be one of the most remarkable acts of accidental preservation in European urban history. It is the story of Bruges, and it begins not with beauty, but with mud. Chapter 1. The Marsh, the Fortress, and the Accidental City. To understand why Bruges exists at all, you need to understand what this part of Europe looked like before anyone built anything here. The coastal plain of what is now northwestern Belgium, in the 9th century, was not the tidy, organized landscape you would recognize today. It was a low-lying expanse of marsh, tidal flats, and shifting waterways, a place where the boundary between land and sea moved with the seasons and sometimes with the tides. The North Sea pushed inland through a network of inlets and creeks. The ground underfoot was unstable. Flooding was not an occasional problem. It was a permanent condition of life. This was not, by any obvious measure, a place where one of the great trading cities of medieval Europe should have been built. But geography in the 9th century was not about comfort. It was about defensibility and access to water, and the particular stretch of coastal marsh that would eventually become Bruges had one feature that outweighed every disadvantage. Running through that marsh was a tidal inlet called the Zwin, a natural channel that connected the interior of Flanders to the open waters of the North Sea. It was shallow and temperamental and prone to shifting. It was also, for ships of the period, navigable, and a navigable waterway connecting inland territory to open sea was, in the 9th century, the closest thing to a highway that existed. The first permanent structure in the area that mattered historically was not a church or a market. It was a fortress. Around the year 865, a Flemish count named Baldwin I, known to history as Baldwin Iron Arm, built a defensive stronghold in this marshy territory. Baldwin had a specific and immediate problem to solve. The Vikings had been raiding the coastal regions of Flanders with increasing regularity and devastating effect. Their shallow-drafted longships moved through exactly the kind of tidal inlets that characterized this coastline, penetrating far inland and striking settlements that assumed they were safe from maritime attack. Baldwin needed a position from which he could monitor the waterways and respond quickly. The location he chose was a point where slightly higher ground rose above the surrounding marsh near a bend in one of the local waterways. It offered sightlines across the flat terrain and access to the water network that the Vikings were using as their highway. It was, in the ruthlessly practical logic of 9th century military engineering, a reasonable choice. What he called the place, or what the people who settled around it called it, tells you something about what they saw there. The name Bruges, in its earliest recorded forms, most likely derives from an Old Norse or Old Dutch word meaning landing stage or mooring place. Not a grand name, not a name that suggests destiny or ambition. A purely functional description of a spot where boats could be tied up. The city that would one day be called the Venice of the North began as a place where you could leave your boat without it drifting away. Baldwin's fortress attracted the usual population that military installations always attracted. Traders who understood that soldiers with regular pay needed somewhere to spend it. Craftsmen who could supply what a garrison market demanded. People who wanted the security that proximity to armed men provided in an era when security was not something you could take for granted. Within a generation of the fortress's construction, a small settlement had grown up around it. The Vikings who prompted Baldwin to build his fortress were, in a historical irony that the people living through it would not have appreciated, inadvertently contributing to the conditions that would make Bruges possible. The Norse presence on the Flemish coast intensified the need for defensible positions near navigable water. It concentrated population around those positions, and it created, in the communities that survived the raids and rebuilt, a practical knowledge of waterway navigation and coastal trade that would prove useful when the raiding era ended and the trading era began. Because that transition was already beginning, the same longships that had brought destruction to the Flemish coast were, in other hands and other contexts, among the most capable cargo vessels in the North Sea world. The traders who operated along this coastline in the 9th and 10th centuries were developing the commercial networks that would eventually connect the Baltic world to the Atlantic and the Channel. Bruges, positioned near the Zwin with its modest fortifications and its small but growing population, was beginning to appear on the mental maps of merchants who needed a reliable stopping point along that coast. This was not a planned development. No one sat down and decided that Bruges would become a trading centre. What happened was the organic accumulation of small decisions by individual merchants who found the place useful. A merchant from England lands his cargo near the Zwin, sells part of it in the local market, buys provisions, and moves on. He comes back the following season because the market. He tells another merchant. That merchant comes and tells another. Over years and then decades, a reputation builds, and a reputation, in medieval commerce, was worth more than any single transaction. The counts of Flanders who succeeded Baldwin understood this. They had watched the commercial activity growing around Bruges, and they understood, with the practical intelligence of men whose power depended on revenue, that merchants generated taxes, and that taxes built fortresses and paid soldiers and kept counts in their counties. They issued charters guaranteeing the rights of merchants to trade freely. They created the legal and institutional framework that made it safe for outsiders to bring their goods and their money to Flemish markets. This was not generosity. It was policy, but the effect was the same either way. By the end of the 10th century, Bruges had moved from being a military outpost in a marshy coastal region to being something with the beginnings of a distinct economic identity. Not yet a great city, not yet a major commercial centre, but a place with a function that people from other places had begun to find useful. The marsh was still there. The flooding still came with the seasons. The ground was still uncertain underfoot. None of that changed. But above that uncertain ground, on the slightly elevated position that Baldwin Iron Arm had chosen for entirely military reasons. A city was beginning to imagine what it might become. It would take 2 more centuries, an industry built on wool, and the arrival of merchants from places as distant as Venice and Genoa, before that imagination turned into something the rest of northern Europe could not ignore. But the foundation was here, laid not in stone but in mud, not by vision but by necessity, not because this was an obvious place to build a great city, but because a 9th century count needed somewhere to watch the waterways for Viking ships. History rarely begins where we expect it to. Bruges began in a marsh, with a man watching the water, waiting for danger, and from that watchtower, from that entirely practical act of military self-preservation, a city began to grow. Chapter 2. The Counts, the Inheritance, and the Art of Holding Flanders Together. In the winter of 1070, a man named Robert found himself in a position that medieval politics produced regularly and that individuals handled with varying degrees of skill. His brother Baldwin VI, Count of Flanders, had died. The county passed to Baldwin's young son, Arnulf III, under the regency of his mother Richilde. Robert, known to history as Robert the Frisian, because he had spent years governing Holland, which was then commonly called Frisia, believed the county should be his. He had support in the northern parts of Flanders. Richilde had support from King Philip I of France, who sent forces to back the young count's claim. Other allies, including Norman knights led by William Fitzosborne, joined the side backing Arnulf. What followed was a Flemish succession struggle that drew in French power, Norman force, and the full complexity of 11th century feudal politics. The 2 sides met at the Battle of Cassel in February 1071. Robert won. His nephew Arnulf was killed in the fighting, along with William Fitzosborne. Richilde herself was captured by Robert's forces, though Robert was briefly captured in turn by allies of the opposing side, and the 2 were eventually exchanged for one another. Robert emerged from the chaos of the battle's aftermath as Count of Flanders. The political settlement that followed was handled with the pragmatic intelligence that characterized the best of the Flemish counts. Rather than leaving Philip of France as a permanent enemy, Robert negotiated. He arranged the marriage of his stepdaughter Bertha of Holland to the French king, converting a recent military opponent into a family connection. The county that had just been won by force was now secured by diplomacy. This combination, the willingness to fight when necessary and to negotiate when possible, was the governing logic of Flemish politics across the 11th and 12th centuries. And it worked because of something that gave the Counts of Flanders a leverage that purely agricultural territories did not possess: money, and the industry that was generating it. Flanders had developed a textile industry of remarkable sophistication. The towns of Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges had become centres of cloth production on a scale that had no real parallel north of the Alps. Flemish weavers were producing woolen cloth of a quality that markets across the continent were willing to pay premium prices to obtain. The raw material, English wool from the sheep that grazed on the limestone uplands of the Cotswolds and the Yorkshire Dales, was the finest available anywhere in the known trading world. The craft knowledge concentrated in the Flemish weaving towns transformed that raw material into finished cloth that buyers from Paris to Palermo sought. This created a commercial triangle that generated wealth at every point. English landowners raised the sheep and sold the wool. Flemish weavers bought the wool, processed it, and sold the cloth. And Bruges, positioned on the Flemish coast with its access to the North Sea and the Channel shipping lanes, sat at the geographic centre of this exchange. The Counts of Flanders understood that their political independence depended on maintaining the conditions that made this commerce possible. A count who could point to Bruges and say, "This city generates the revenues that fund my administration and sustain my independence," was a count whose position had a material foundation that pure military strength alone could not have provided. The wealth of the textile cities was not simply an economic fact. It was a political argument, and that argument was tested repeatedly across the 12th century as the kings of France extended their reach. The counts navigated these pressures with the skills of people who had learned, across generations, that commercial importance was a form of power that military force could not simply extinguish. Kings needed the revenues that Flemish trade generated. They needed the cloth that Flemish weavers produced. They needed access to the commercial networks that ran through Bruges. And a city that kings needed was a city with options. The internal dynamics of Flanders in this period were also shaping the character of Bruges in ways that would prove consequential. The cloth workers of the city, the weavers and fullers and dyers whose labour was the foundation of the entire commercial structure, had developed their own organisational structures through the guild system. The guilds were not simply trade associations. They were political institutions, bodies that represented the collective interests of their members and that had, through the accumulation of membership, resources, and organisational capacity, become powers in the city that the wealthy merchant class could not entirely ignore. The tension between the patrician merchants who controlled Bruges politically and the artisan class whose labour generated the wealth those families enjoyed was building slowly through the 12th and early 13th centuries. The craftsmen who worked the looms were not people who could be managed indefinitely by the threat of losing access to land. Their skills were their capital, their guilds were their collective voice, and their patience with exclusion from political power had limits that the merchant class consistently underestimated. That tension would eventually produce one of the most remarkable events in medieval Flemish history. But before the confrontation came, something else arrived in Bruges that changed the nature of the city's commercial life entirely. The Italians came to stay. The great banking and trading families of Genoa and Venice and Florence had been operating in the north since the 12th century. Attending the great fairs of Champagne in eastern France, where twice yearly merchants gathered to buy and sell across the full range of European commerce. But the fairs of Champagne were temporary. They lasted weeks. The merchants who attended them travelled great distances, set up, transacted, and moved on. What they could not do in a temporary fair was build the kind of permanent commercial infrastructure that sustained relationships and complex multi-party transactions required. Bruges offered something the fairs could not: a permanent market, a year-round commercial presence where merchants could establish themselves, build warehouses, hire local agents, and develop relationships over years rather than weeks. The Genoese arrived first, then the Venetians, then the Florentines and the Lucchese. Each established organised communities in the city, with their own buildings, their own internal governance, and their own commercial strategies, and with them came the financial tools that the Italian city-states had developed across a century of Mediterranean commerce: the letter of credit, the bill of exchange, the deposit account that allowed merchants to move value across long distances without physically transporting coin. These tools did not originate in Bruges. They had been developed in the Mediterranean commercial world over generations. What happened in Bruges was that they arrived simultaneously from multiple directions, were applied to a commercial environment of exceptional scale and complexity, and were adapted by the Flemish merchant community in ways that made them more widely accessible across the northern trading world. The physical centre of this financial activity was a square in the city that took its character from a family called Van der Beurs, who ran an inn that served as the natural gathering point for merchants conducting informal business. The Van der Beurs name, repeated daily by merchants who said they were going to the Bourse to meet their counterparts, entered the commercial vocabulary of Northern Europe. The Dutch word beurs, the French word bourse, and through them the concept of the organized financial exchange that underlies many modern financial markets, carry the name of a Flemish innkeeper whose primary qualification was geography. That is an appropriate origin for financial markets. Not vision, not planning, not deliberate institutional design, just a convenient location and the accumulated habit of merchants who found it easier to meet in the same place every day than to search for each other across the city. By the end of the 13th century, Bruges had become something that Robert the Frisian, building his political strategy around the revenues of the textile towns 2 centuries earlier, had set in motion but could not have fully imagined. It had become a city where merchants from 17 or more distinct national communities maintained permanent establishments, where the exchange rates between currencies were being set by the daily interactions of traders from Genoa and Lubeck and London and Barcelona, and where the volume of commercial activity flowing through the Zwin inlet was, by the standards of Northern Europe, without precedent. The question of who this wealth belonged to, and who had the right to govern the city that generated it, had not been answered, and the answer, when it finally came, would come not in a counting house, but on a battlefield. Chapter 3. Wool, Wealth, and the Making of a Commercial Centre. What follows is an illustration grounded in what the historical record shows about how the Bruges wool trade actually functioned. It is not a documented individual event, but a composite picture of a real commercial process. Picture a bale of English wool arriving at the outer harbour of Dam in the year 1200, transferred from a seagoing vessel onto a flat-bottomed boat, and moved through the canal system into the heart of Bruges. It has been sheared from sheep grazing on the limestone uplands of the Cotswolds, or perhaps from one of the great flocks maintained by the Cistercian monasteries of Yorkshire, whose agricultural operations were among the most efficiently managed in medieval Europe. The fleece is long stapled and fine, the kind that Flemish weavers would pay a premium to obtain because it produces cloth with a smoothness and durability that shorter, coarser wools cannot match. That bale of wool is about to begin a journey that will take it from an English hillside to a warehouse in Bruges, from a warehouse to a weaving house, from a weaving house to a finished bolt of cloth, and from that bolt of cloth to markets in Paris, in Florence, in the courts of kings and bishops across the breadth of Europe. Along the way it will pass through the hands of perhaps a dozen different merchants, each of whom will add something to its value and take something from its price. Bruges was not simply the city where this wool arrived and this cloth was sold. It was the city where the commercial infrastructure that made the whole system function at Northern European scale was being built in real time. The English wool trade into Flanders had been growing since the 11th century. But it was in the late 12th and 13th centuries that it reached a scale that transformed everything around it. The volumes involved were, by medieval standards, substantial. At the peak of the trade, England was exporting somewhere in the range of 30,000 to 40,000 sacks of wool per year, according to estimates drawn from the customs records that survive from this period. A figure documented in the scholarship of T.H. Lloyd on the English wool trade, with each sack containing roughly 360 pounds of raw fleece. The Flemish cloth industry consumed enormous quantities of this material and converted it into finished cloth that was sold across Europe and into the Mediterranean world. The financing of this trade required mechanisms that went well beyond the simple exchange of goods for coin. An English wool merchant selling a large consignment to a Flemish buyer could not wait until the buyer had assembled the full purchase price in cash. The whole chain of transactions required credit, the ability to make promises about future payment that were credible enough that the people receiving those promises would act on them. The Italian merchants who had established themselves in Bruges brought with them financial techniques developed over generations of Mediterranean commerce. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, deposit banking systems that allowed merchants to maintain accounts in Bruges and draw on them in Florence or Genoa without physically transporting coin. These tools did not originate in Bruges, and precision about this matters. Genoa, Venice, and Florence had been developing and refining these instruments since at least the 12th century. What Bruges contributed was a commercial environment of sufficient scale and international diversity that these tools were extended, adapted, and made accessible to a wider range of participants than had been possible in any single location in the north before. The organizational structure that Bruges developed to manage its international trade was genuinely distinctive. The city did not simply allow foreign merchants to trade as individuals. It developed a system of recognized national communities, called nations, each of which represented the merchants of a specific country or region and had its own organizational structure, its own legal rights, and its own relationship with the Bruges city government. The Hanseatic League, the great commercial confederation of northern European trading cities stretching from the Baltic coast to the North Sea, established a permanent trading post in Bruges called the Contour, one of only 4 such establishments the League maintained across Europe. The Genoese had their own quarter, the Venetians had theirs, the Spanish, the English, the Scots. Each maintained organized commercial presences in the city. At the peak of Bruges' commercial activity in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, somewhere between 17 and 20 distinct national merchant communities were maintaining permanent establishments in the city. According to the research documented in the work of historians, including David Nicholas on medieval Flemish urban society, what did that mean in practice? On any given day in Bruges, in the year 1280, you could walk through streets where merchants from Genoa negotiated with merchants from Lubeck, while Venetian agents counted bolts of Flemish cloth destined for Mediterranean markets, and English wool brokers finalized delivery schedules with Flemish master weavers. The city was, in the fullest operational sense, international. The goods that moved through Bruges were not limited to wool and cloth. The city's position made it the natural meeting point for the commercial exchange between the Baltic world and the broader Atlantic and Mediterranean trading zones. From the north and east came furs, amber, timber, grain, and the dried and salted fish that fed Catholic Europe through its many days of obligatory abstinence. From the south came wine, spices, silks, and the luxury goods that the growing wealth of northern European courts and merchant families was generating demand for. Bruges sat at the midpoint of this exchange and took its share from both directions. The population of the city grew to match the ambition of its commerce. By the mid-13th century, Bruges had somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 inhabitants, making it one of the larger cities in northern Europe. Though the precision of medieval population estimates should always be treated with appropriate caution, the city was building itself in ways that expressed the confidence of its commercial success. The Belfry, the great bell tower that still dominates the market square of Bruges today, was under construction from the late 13th century. It was not primarily a religious building. It was a civic one, built by the city government as a statement of urban authority and practical administrative function. The bells in the tower regulated the working day for the city's weavers and traders. They called citizens to assembly. They raised the alarm in case of fire or attack. They measured time in a city where time had a direct commercial value. The belfry was also a treasury and a record archive. The city's most important documents, its charters, its commercial agreements, its legal records, were stored in the tower under lock and key. Architecture as administration, form following function in the most pragmatic medieval way. But the commercial success of Bruges in the 13th century was not achieved without the tensions that any significant concentration of wealth and competing interests produces. The clothworkers of Bruges, the weavers and fullers and dyers, whose labour was the foundation of the entire commercial structure, were not simply grateful beneficiaries of the city's prosperity. They were workers with specific grievances about wages, working conditions, and their exclusion from political power by the wealthy merchant class that dominated the city government. The tension between the patrician merchant families who controlled Bruges politically and the artisan class whose labour generated the wealth those families enjoyed was building through the late 13th century toward a confrontation that would, when it finally came, shake not just Bruges, but the political assumptions of the entire region. That confrontation was approaching, and it would take a form that the comfortable merchant houses of 13th century Bruges had not predicted. It would come not from a rival city or a foreign king, but from the looms themselves. Chapter 4. The Golden Age and the City that Became Necessary. There is a moment in the life of every great city when everything arrives at once. Population and money and ambition and faith converge in the same generation, and what emerges is not simply a larger version of what existed before. It is something qualitatively different, a city that has crossed a threshold from which there is no return, a place that has become, in the fullest sense, necessary to the world around it. For Bruges, that moment came in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and what it produced was not simply the wealthiest city in northern Europe. It was a commercial environment whose scale and sophistication had no precedent in this part of the world. The numbers, where they survive in the historical record, are striking. The toll records from the Zwin inlet, the customs accounts maintained by the Counts of Flanders, and the commercial correspondence of Italian banking houses all point toward a city handling volumes of trade that were exceptional for northern Europe at this time. Historians studying the commercial records of this period have noted that by the early 14th century, Bruges was handling a disproportionately large share of the commercial exchange between the British Isles, the Baltic world, and the Mediterranean zone. The precise proportions are debated, as they always are when medieval statistics are involved. The general scale is not. The physical infrastructure of the city was expanding to match. The canal system that still defines the appearance of Bruges today was being developed and extended through the 13th century, creating a network of internal waterways that connected the various quarters of the city to each other and to the Zwin channel that led to the sea. Goods could be unloaded from seagoing vessels at the outer harbour of Dam, transferred to smaller, flat-bottomed boats, and moved directly into the heart of the city through the canal system to be deposited in warehouses without ever leaving the water. It was, by the standards of the 13th century, a logistics operation of remarkable efficiency. The warehouses that lined the canals were not the picturesque heritage buildings that tourists photograph today. They were working industrial facilities built for storage and security. The beautiful stepped gable facades that characterize the historic buildings of Bruges today were, in their original form, practical solutions to the problem of roof drainage in a rainy climate. Aesthetic traditions grow from functional necessities. The visual character of Bruges is inseparable from the commercial function those buildings were designed to serve. The community of foreign merchants that had been developing in Bruges since the 12th century reached, in the early 14th century, a scale and sophistication that made the city genuinely unlike anywhere else in Northern Europe. The national communities, the organized groupings of merchants from specific countries or regions, had developed into substantial institutions with their own buildings, their own internal governance structures, their own legal relationships with the city authorities, and their own social and religious lives. The Hanseatic contour in Bruges was among the most important of these institutions. The Hanseatic League, the trading confederation that linked cities from Lübeck and Hamburg in the west to Riga and Tallinn in the east, maintained its principal Western European commercial presence in Bruges. The contour was not simply a trading post. It was a city within a city, with its own warehouses, its own guest houses for travelling merchants, its own chapel, and its own courts for resolving disputes among league members. The Hanseatic merchants brought with them the products of the Baltic world, the grain, the timber, the furs, the amber that Western Europe needed and that Bruges was positioned to distribute. Against the Hanseatic presence, the Italian communities maintained their own distinct character and their own distinct commercial function. The Genius, the Venetians, the Florentines, the Lucchese, each operated through their own organizational structures while competing fiercely with each other for advantage in the Bruges market. What they all brought, beyond the luxury goods of the Mediterranean world, was financial sophistication. The deposit banking system that allowed merchants to maintain accounts in Bruges and draw on those accounts in distant cities without physically transporting coin was a service that the Bruges commercial community adopted and extended to its own operations. It was this combination of physical scale and financial infrastructure that made Bruges something more than a very large market. It made it a commercial centre where the concentration of international merchants and the competition between them drove the adoption of the best available commercial practices faster than those practices spread elsewhere. Cities that host competition between sophisticated actors tend to develop faster than cities that do not. Bruges, in the early 14th century, was one of the most competitive commercial environments in the northern world. The gathering place for the daily interactions that set prices and established credit conditions was the square near the Van der Beurs Inn. Merchants came there not just to buy and sell physical goods, but to negotiate credit, to exchange information about market conditions in distant cities, to make and receive payments through the network of correspondent relationships that connected Bruges to commercial centres across the known trading world. The Van der Beurs family gave their name to this activity without, so far as the historical record shows, doing anything particularly remarkable beyond running a well-located inn. Their establishment happened to be at the centre of one of the most active commercial exchanges in Northern Europe. Their name, repeated daily by merchants who said they were going to the Bourse to conduct their business, entered the commercial vocabulary of Europe and eventually of the world. The Dutch word beurs, the French word bourse, and through them the concept of the organized financial exchange, carry the family name of a Flemish innkeeper. History's debt to the unremarkable is, in cases like this one, considerably larger than it first appears. By the early 14th century, the Bruges exchange was influencing prices and credit conditions that affected merchants across the continent. The information that circulated there about harvests and wars and the solvency of distant trading partners moved faster than any official communication, and influenced commercial decisions from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Bruges had become, in the language of modern economic history, a systemically important commercial node whose stability or disruption had consequences that extended far beyond its own borders. The population of the city reflected this position. By the early 14th century, Bruges likely had somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 inhabitants, making it comparable in scale to London at the same period. Though demographic estimates for medieval cities carry substantial uncertainty, whatever the precise figure, it was a city of genuine metropolitan scale, dense and noisy and commercially intense in ways that the marshy outpost of 4 centuries earlier could not have suggested. The political life of the city was dominated by a patrician class of wealthy merchants and landowners whose control of city government they used to protect and advance their economic interests. They negotiated with the counts of Flanders from a position of real strength, because the counts needed the revenues that Bruges generated and understood that destroying the conditions of commercial success would be self-defeating. But the patrician class faced a challenge from below that their political control could not simply suppress. The craftsmen and workers who formed the economic base of the city had developed, through the guild system, organizational structures that gave them collective power the patricians could not ignore. The guilds were bodies that represented the interests of their members and that had, through the accumulation of membership and resources, become political actors in their own right. The tension between the patrician merchant class and the artisan guilds was not unique to Bruges, but in Bruges, the combination of the city's wealth, the sophistication of its commercial life, and the particular political circumstances of Flanders in the early 14th century gave that tension a context in which it would produce consequences of regional significance. The French king Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, had been extending royal authority across France with a systematic thoroughness that left no significant power centre unmolested. In 1297, he moved militarily against Flanders and forced the Count, Guy of Dampierre, into a submission that gave France effective control over the county. For the patrician class of Bruges, French royal domination was unwelcome but manageable. They calculated that accommodation with French power was preferable to resistance and adjusted their political behaviour accordingly. For the artisan class, the calculation was entirely different. French domination meant French taxation. It meant interference with the commercial arrangements that governed their working lives. It meant, in the most immediate practical terms, a threat to the livelihoods of people who were already living with narrow margins and deep grievances about their exclusion from political power. The collision that was coming would not be a negotiation. It would be a battle, and it would produce one of the most consequential military upsets in medieval Flemish history. Chapter 5. The Golden Spurs and the Morning that Changed Flanders. On the morning of the 11th of July, 1302, a French military force assembled on the plain near the town of Kortrijk with orders to end a Flemish rebellion. The French knights who prepared for battle that morning had reasons for confidence that went beyond individual courage. They were professional warriors, trained for mounted combat since childhood, armoured in steel, riding horses bred specifically for the shock of cavalry charge. Their opponents were weavers, fullers, butchers, and tradesmen, men who worked with their hands in shops and workshops. The two forces were not, by the military assumptions of the time, comparably. The military logic of the period appeared to favour the French entirely. For 2 centuries, the armoured knight on horseback had been the decisive force on the battlefield. The common wisdom of medieval military thinking held that infantry, however numerous, could not withstand a determined cavalry charge. History appeared to support that common wisdom. It was about to be tested on this particular field in Flanders. What had brought these two forces to this field requires understanding the events of the preceding weeks, which had transformed the political situation in Flanders with a speed that left the French administration struggling to respond. The French occupation of Flanders, which had solidified over the years following 1297, had produced the predictable resentments among a population that valued its commercial independence. The patrician class of Bruges had chosen accommodation. The artisan class had not. In the early morning hours of the 18th of May, 1302, a weaver named Peter de Koninck and a butcher named Jan Breidel led Flemish craftsmen through Bruges before dawn. What followed was the event that became known as the Bruges Matins. Armed insurrectionists entered the houses where the French were garrisoned and carried out a violent and organized massacre, killing the French soldiers and their Flemish collaborators in their sleep. According to the tradition that grew up around the event, those suspected of being French were asked to repeat the Flemish phrase "shield en vrond," meaning shield and friend, a combination of sounds that French speakers could not reproduce accurately. The governor Jacques de Châtillon barely escaped with his life. It was not a negotiation or a political gesture. It was a decisive and brutal break from which there was no turning back. The action sparked a broader Flemish military mobilization that brought an army to the field at Kortrijk 7 weeks later. The Flemish force that assembled there was unlike anything the French commanders had encountered in this context before. It was not a feudal army organized around noble households and their military retinues. It was an urban militia, organized through the guild structure of the Flemish towns, equipped with the pike and the godendag, a heavy wooden staff tipped with an iron spike, and motivated in a way that professional soldiers are not always required to possess. These men had chosen to be there. They were fighting for their livelihoods, their city, and their right to govern themselves. They had also prepared the ground with a care that their opponents had not fully anticipated. The field near Kortrijk was crossed by drainage ditches and the soft, waterlogged terrain of the Flemish countryside. The Flemish commanders used that terrain deliberately, positioning their forces behind obstacles and concealing ditches with dirt and branches in ways that would frustrate the cavalry charge that the French would inevitably attempt. When the French cavalry charged, horses drove into ground that would not support their weight and over obstacles that broke their momentum. Knights in full armour, unhorsed in soft terrain, were effectively immobilized. The pikes and godendags of the Flemish infantry did the rest. The French force was broken. Robert II, Count of Artois, who commanded the French army, was killed in the fighting. Dozens of senior French nobles died on that field. What happened after the battle is the detail that gives the event its name and its historical resonance. The victorious Flemish militia stripped the Golden Spurs from the fallen French knights, the spurs that were the symbol of knightly status, and hung them in the church of Our Lady in Kortrijk as a trophy. Contemporary chronicles differ on the precise number collected, with accounts ranging from several hundred to 500 pairs. A discrepancy that reflects both the chaos of the aftermath and the tendency of medieval chroniclers to favour dramatic figures. What is not in doubt is the symbolic act itself and what it meant to those who performed it and those who heard about it. The Battle of the Golden Spurs sent a significant shock through the political and military thinking of Flanders and the surrounding region. Military historians have recognized it as one of the early demonstrations of what would eventually become a broader pattern in later medieval warfare. The vulnerability of heavy cavalry to well-prepared infantry in terrain that neutralized the advantages of the mounted charge. The battle is examined in this context by scholars, including J.F. Verbruggen in his detailed study of the engagement. Whether subsequent commanders in other conflicts had Kortrijk specifically in mind is unprovable. But the event entered the collective memory of the region as proof of something that had not previously been demonstrated so directly on this scale. For Bruges specifically, the victory at Kortrijk had immediate and practical consequences. French control of Flanders was broken, at least temporarily. The Peace of Athis-sur-Orge in 1305 eventually restored a degree of French influence, but the terms were negotiated rather than simply imposed. The artisan class that had organized the Bruges Matins and fought at Kortrijk had demonstrated a collective strength that the patricians and the counts could not simply ignore. The guilds pressed for and obtained greater representation in city government in the years following. But here is the dimension of the Golden Spurs that the conventional telling of the story most often underemphasizes. The battle was fought for economic reasons as much as political ones. The Flemish craftsmen were not simply asserting abstract rights. They were defending the commercial system that gave their labour value. French domination threatened the wool trade with England, threatened the commercial independence that allowed Bruges to function as an international market, threatened the entire economic ecosystem that the city had spent 2 centuries building. The Golden Spurs in the church at Kortrijk were not just a trophy. They were a statement that the people who built the wealth of Flanders understood what they had built and were willing to fight for it. That understanding that a commercial civilization is worth defending with force when necessary was itself a notable idea in a world where the right to use force had been the near exclusive claim of the aristocratic military class. Bruges in 1302 had demonstrated that the medieval social order was not as fixed as those at the top of it preferred to believe. What it did not yet know was that the extraordinary commercial civilization it had constructed was approaching the moment when the forces that had built it would begin, slowly and then with gathering speed, to work against it. The water outside was shifting, the channel was changing, and the commercial civilization that had made all of this possible was approaching an ending that would come not with fire or conquest, but with something much quieter and much more final. But before that change became visible, the city had one more extraordinary gift to give the world. It came not from a merchant or a soldier, but from a painter who looked at the material world of Bruges with more precision than any human eye had brought to it before. Chapter 6. Jan van Eyck and the city that documented itself. There is a painting in the National Gallery in London that stops certain visitors in a way that is difficult to explain. It shows a man and a woman standing in a simply furnished room. The light comes from a window on the left. On the floor, a small dog. On the wall behind the couple, a convex mirror reflecting the entire room, including 2 figures standing in the doorway, one of whom may be the painter himself. The woman's green dress pools on the wooden floor in folds of such precise observation that you can almost feel the weight of the fabric. The man's black hat casts a shadow across his face with an accuracy that suggests the painter understood exactly where the light source was and calculated its effect on every surface in the room. The painting is called the Arnolfini portrait. It was made in Bruges in the year 1434 by a man named Jan van Eyck, and above the convex mirror, in the careful Latin script of a legal attestation rather than an artistic signature, it reads, Jan van Eyck was here, 1434. Not a signature in the artistic sense. A record of presence. The painter as witness to something. The painting has been interpreted by art historians in many ways across the centuries, and the scholarly debate about its precise meaning continues today. It has been read as a marriage portrait, a betrothal scene, a memorial to a deceased wife, and a legal record of a commercial or personal arrangement. What most interpretations share is the recognition that the inscription above the mirror, written in the style of legal attestation, suggests the painting was intended to document and certify something of significance, not merely to depict two people in a room. The man is almost certainly Giovanni di Niccolao Arnolfini, a merchant from Lucca who had established himself in Bruges as part of the Italian commercial community. Beyond that, the painting continues to ask questions that art history has not fully resolved. That ongoing scholarly debate does not diminish the painting. If anything, it deepens it, because what makes the Arnolfini portrait extraordinary for the story of Bruges is not what it depicts in legal terms. It is how it depicts the world in visual ones. To understand Jan van Eyck, you need to understand the world that produced him. And the world that produced him was Bruges in the first half of the 15th century, a city at a high point of its cultural ambition under the patronage of the Burgundian dukes. The Duchy of Burgundy in the late 14th and early 15th centuries had become one of the most powerful and culturally ambitious political entities in Western Europe. The Valois Dukes of Burgundy, ruling territory that extended from the Flemish coast through what is now Belgium and the Netherlands and into the wine regions of eastern France, maintained a court of extraordinary cultural investment. Philip the Good, who became Duke of Burgundy in 1419 and ruled until 1467, maintained his primary court in the Low Countries, and within the Low Countries, Bruges was his preferred city. Jan van Eyck arrived in this environment sometime around 1425. When Philip the Good appointed him as court painter and personal attendant, a position that combined artistic service with genuine personal trust. Philip sent him on diplomatic missions to Portugal and Spain. He trusted him with tasks that required discretion and intelligence as well as skill. Van Eyck was not simply a painter hired to produce images. He was a man of the Burgundian court in the fullest sense. What Van Eyck did with the oil painting technique he worked with, a technique he refined and extended rather than invented from scratch despite what some early sources claimed, was to push the possibilities of the medium further than any previous painter had taken it in this part of Europe. The key was the use of oil as a binding medium for pigments, which dried more slowly than the egg tempera that had dominated panel painting in the preceding centuries. The slower drying time allowed the painter to build up thin, transparent layers, called glazes, that modified the colour and luminosity of what lay beneath, to blend colours on the surface, and to achieve gradations of tone and texture that the earlier technique could not produce. In Van Eyck's hands, this technical capacity produced something that contemporaries found extraordinary. The surfaces in his paintings, the metal, the glass, the fabric, the human skin, appeared not simply like representations of those materials, but like the materials themselves rendered in another medium. The convex mirror in the Arnolfini portrait reflects a distorted image of the room that obeys the optical laws of convex reflection with geometric accuracy. The chandelier above the couple casts light and shadow consistent with a real light source. The fur trim on the man's coat has the depth and texture of actual fur seen in specific light. This was not technical virtuosity for its own sake. It was, in the context of Bruges in the 1430s, a statement about the value of the visible world that the commercial culture of the city was uniquely positioned to receive. The merchants of Bruges had built their civilization on the precise assessment of physical objects. The quality of a bolt of cloth, the weight of a coin, the condition of a cargo, the authenticity of a jewel. All of these required the ability to see accurately and judge what you saw. The commercial culture of Bruges was, at its foundation, a culture of close and consequential observation. Van Eyck's painting was the supreme artistic expression of that culture. It looked at the world with the same precision that a merchant applied to a commercial transaction and rendered what it saw with a fidelity that the commercial world could immediately recognize and value. The objects that fill his paintings are not generic props. They are specific things rendered with attention that implies genuine interest in their particularity. The brass chandelier in the Arnolfini portrait is not a generic chandelier. It is a specific object of identifiable type, the kind that a Bruges merchant of the period would have recognized immediately as an item of known quality. The green dress is not a generic dress. It is a specific garment of expensive fabric, cut in a particular fashion, worn in a particular way. Van Eyck was documenting the material world of Bruges at a moment of considerable prosperity, and he was doing it with a precision that amounted to a philosophical position. This world, these objects, this light on these surfaces, is real and worth seeing clearly. He was not the only significant painter working in the Flemish tradition in this period. Rogier van der Weyden, Hans Memling, Petrus Christus, Gerard David, the painters now known collectively as the Flemish Primitives, formed a tradition of exceptional quality whose work was being purchased by buyers across Europe. The Ghent altarpiece, completed in 1432 by Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert van Eyck, was immediately recognized as one of the major achievements of Northern European painting. It was commissioned not by the Burgundian court, but by a wealthy Ghent merchant named Jus Weide and his wife Elizabeth Borluut, people of the same commercial class that had built the Flemish cities, who understood that patronizing great art was both a religious act and a statement of cultural standing. The patronage network that supported this artistic production was the merchant community. Italian merchants sent Flemish paintings back to Florence and Genoa and Milan, where they influenced the development of Italian Renaissance art in ways that art history has not always emphasized sufficiently. The triptychs and devotional panels that Van Eyck and his successors produced were commercial products as much as religious ones, made to order for buyers across Europe who wanted the finest painting available. And this is the insight that changes how you understand the Bruges of 1434. This was not a city where commerce and culture existed in separate compartments. It was a city where 3 generations of commercial success had produced a confidence in the material world so deep that it commissioned a painter to look at that world more precisely than any human eye had yet done, and to record what he saw. The wealth of Bruges had bought many things. It had bought the belfry and the guild houses and the canal infrastructure and the great churches. It had bought the financial relationships that connected the city to markets from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. It had bought the political independence, hard-won at Kortrijk, to govern itself by its own lights. And it had bought Jan van Eyck, standing in a merchant's room in 1434, watching the light fall on a green dress, and writing on the wall above a mirror, "I was here." What no one in that room knew, and what no amount of visual precision could have revealed, was that the world being so carefully documented was already beginning to disappear. The water outside was shifting, the channel was changing, and the commercial civilization that had made all of this possible was approaching an ending that would come not with fire or conquest, but with something much quieter and much more final. Sand. Chapter 7. Chapter 7, when the water left, and the miracle nobody planned. There is a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself, not the ending that comes with fire or conquest, not the kind that leaves rubble in the streets and forces the survivors to rebuild from visible ruins. Those endings are dramatic. They have a before and an after that everyone living through them can identify. The city was standing, then it was not. The moment of change is unmistakable. The ending that came to Bruges was different. It came the way a tide goes out on a flat beach, so gradually that you do not notice the water receding until you look down and realize your feet are no longer wet. And by the time you notice, the sea is already a long way off. What follows is a composite illustration grounded in what the historical record shows about the conditions merchants faced in Bruges during this period. It is not a documented individual, but a picture assembled from what we know about how the city's commercial life actually changed. Picture a merchant in Bruges in the year 1450. His family has been in this city for 3 generations. His grandfather came here from Genoa in the 1380s, drawn by the same forces that had drawn Italian merchants to Bruges for 2 centuries. His father built on what his grandfather established. He has continued what his father built, the warehouse near the canal. The correspondent relationships with merchants in London and Lubeck and Barcelona. The accounts maintained through the network of Florentine bankers. All of this is the inheritance of 3 generations of careful commercial work. Now something is wrong. It has been wrong for some time, but wrong in the way that gradual changes are wrong. Slowly enough that each individual development seems manageable. Quickly enough in aggregate that the cumulative effect is becoming impossible to ignore. The ships are not coming as far as they used to. The Zwin inlet, the tidal channel that had been the commercial artery of Bruges for 2 centuries, is silting up. It has been silting up for decades. So gradually that the change was barely perceptible at first. A sandbar here, a shallower channel there. The need, increasingly frequent, for dredging that removes accumulated sediment but cannot permanently reverse the underlying process. The large seagoing vessels that used to come all the way to Dam, the outer harbour of Bruges, now have difficulty reaching even that point. Goods must be transferred to smaller vessels further and further from the city. This is not merely inconvenient, it is existential. The entire commercial logic of Bruges depended on its position as the natural meeting point between the goods of the north arriving by sea and the goods of the south arriving overland and by river. That meeting point existed because ships could reach the city. If ships could not reach the city, there was no meeting point. There was just an inland Flemish town with a declining canal system and a warehouse network that was no longer receiving the goods it was built to store. The silting of the Zwin was not caused by human error or negligence. It was the product of natural processes that no medieval engineering could have controlled. The tidal dynamics of the North Sea coastline had always been in motion, the same forces that had created the Zwin inlet in the first place. The interaction of tidal flow, storm events, and the movement of sand and sediment along the coast were now working against it. The inlet that had been navigable through the 11th and 12th centuries was now narrowing and shallowing as those same processes moved in a different direction. The specific timeline of the Zwin's deterioration has been reconstructed by historians and geographers from a combination of documentary sources and physical evidence, including analysis of sediment deposits from the former channel. What that reconstruction shows is a process that began in the late 14th century and accelerated through the 15th, punctuated by storm events that briefly reopened channels before the silting resumed. There were periods of relative improvement that must have raised hopes, and periods of renewed deterioration that extinguished them. But the long-term trend was unmistakable, and the merchants of Bruges, who were professional assessors of commercial risk and commercial opportunity, understood trends. The city government attempted to respond. Dredging operations were commissioned and carried out repeatedly through the 15th century. New channels were attempted, The infrastructure of the outer harbour at Dam was maintained and improved, but these were measures that could slow the deterioration, not reverse it. The underlying problem was geological, not administrative, and no administrative response could solve a geological problem. As the Zwin silted up, the commercial logic that had made Bruges the centre of northern European trade began to reassemble itself elsewhere, and the place it reassembled was Antwerp, a city on the Scheldt estuary 40 miles to the east, whose harbour was deeper, more reliably navigable, and better positioned to serve the changing geography of European trade. The shift was not sudden. It happened over decades, a migration of commercial activity that accelerated through the second half of the 15th century and became decisive in the early 16th century. The Hanseatic merchants began diverting more of their trade to Antwerp. The Italian banking houses opened offices there. The English merchant adventurers, who had been an important presence in Bruges for generations, moved their official trading post from Bruges to Antwerp in 1496. Each departure made the next departure more likely, because commercial activity is self-reinforcing in both directions. The more business concentrates in one place, the more reason other businesses have to follow. Bruges was experiencing this logic in reverse. The Burgundian court, which had given the city its cultural splendour under Philip the Good, also shifted. The administrative centre of the Low Countries moved as the Habsburg inheritance absorbed the Burgundian territories, and the political geography of the region reorganised around new centres of power. The population of Bruges began to fall. The estimates that can be reconstructed from tax records and administrative documents suggest a substantial drop from the peak of the early 14th century. These numbers carry the uncertainty that all medieval demographic estimates carry. But the direction of change is not in doubt. Bruges was contracting, and here is the moment that changes everything about how you understand the city you can visit today. Because what happened next? What happened as Bruges lost its merchants and its court and its population and its commercial purpose was not what happens to most declining cities. In most declining cities, the buildings that housed the commercial activity are repurposed and eventually replaced. The medieval warehouse becomes something else. The guild house is modified. The great commercial buildings are adapted or demolished by the forces of a different economy trying to use the same urban space. In Bruges, this did not happen, and the reason it did not happen is, in its way, the most consequential fact in the city's entire history. It did not happen because there was no money to do it. The same economic decline that had driven away the merchants had also eliminated the capital that would have been needed to redevelop the city. Building requires investment. Investment requires confidence in future returns. A city whose commercial reason for existence had relocated to Antwerp was not a city in which rational investors were placing large bets on new construction. The wealthy had left with the trade. The institutional capital that remained was concentrated not in commercial enterprises, but in the religious institutions that were, through a historical irony of considerable elegance, moving into the spaces that commerce had vacated. The Beguinage, communities of lay religious women that had been a feature of Flemish urban life since the 13th century, expanded in Bruges during the period of commercial decline. These were not conventional convents. The Beguines were women who lived communally, practiced religious devotion, and supported themselves through textile work and other crafts, but who were not bound by permanent vows and were not formally part of the regular religious orders. They occupied buildings, maintained gardens, and created within the walls of Bruges a form of organized religious community that was, in its quiet way, a remarkably effective custodian for a city that no longer had commerce to drive it forward. The religious houses that expanded into the former merchant quarters of Bruges were not agents of preservation in the modern sense. They were simply institutions with limited resources occupying existing buildings, because existing buildings were cheaper than new construction. In a city where land values had collapsed along with the commercial economy, there was no pressure to do anything else. But the effect of their occupation was preservation. The buildings that religious communities moved into were maintained rather than demolished. The canal-side warehouses that had once stored English wool now housed quieter purposes. The guild houses that had once been the meeting places of international merchants now served different communities. The physical fabric of the city was not updated because there was no economic reason to update it, and no financial capacity to do so, even if the reason had existed. Bruges was, through the 16th and 17th centuries, becoming something for which the world did not yet have a name. Not a ruin, because the buildings were maintained, not a living commercial city, because the commerce was gone, something in between, a city preserved by the very absence of the energy that had built it. And the remarkable thing, the thing that becomes clear only when you look at the history from sufficient distance, is that this condition was one of the best things that could have happened to the physical fabric of the city. Many other major cities in northern Europe modernized. Brussels rebuilt its centre in the grand style of the 17th and 18th centuries. Antwerp grew into a modern commercial port whose medieval fabric survives only in fragments. London burned in 1666 and rebuilt in brick and stone. Paris was transformed in the 1850s and 60s by Baron Haussmann, whose great boulevards cut through the medieval street plan with an efficiency that left the old city visible only in isolated pockets. Bruges did none of these things, not because anyone decided it should be preserved, because the economic conditions that would have driven change never returned strongly enough to overcome the inertia of the existing fabric. The city that tourists walk through today, the city that has been on the UNESCO World Heritage List since the year 2000, exists in the form it takes because a harbour silted up in the 15th century and no one ever had enough money to tear it down. This is not a poetic exaggeration. This is the literal mechanism of preservation. The catastrophe that looked, in 1450, like the ending of everything Bruges had built, turned out to be the mechanism by which everything Bruges had built was saved. There is no better illustration in European history of the principle that historical outcomes are almost never what the people living through them expected. The merchants who watched the ships stop coming did not think they were preserving a World Heritage Site for future generations. They thought they were watching the end of their world. They were right about the end of their world. They were wrong about what that ending meant. The city that froze was not a city that chose to freeze. It was a city that ran out of the resources to change, and in running out of those resources, it accidentally kept something that many other cities in northern Europe were destroying in the name of progress. The silence that descended on Bruges in the 16th century was the silence of economic failure, but it was also, though no one living in it could have known this, the silence of something being kept. Chapter 8. 300 Years of Quiet. To understand what 300 years of silence actually looks like from the inside, consider the following composite picture, assembled from what the historical record shows about life in Bruges during this long period of contraction. A woman sits at a window somewhere in the city in the 16th century, a lace pillow on her lap, her fingers working with a speed and precision that comes only from years of practice. She winds her bobbins, places her pins, builds the pattern thread by thread in the way she learned from her mother and her mother's mother before her. The canal outside the window reflects a sky that has not changed since the merchants of the Golden Age looked at it. The buildings across the water are the same buildings those merchants occupied. But the activity inside them is entirely different now. The lace that she makes is the product of a skill that developed in Bruges precisely because the commercial infrastructure that had once supported the great textile industry had collapsed. The weaving of fine cloth required raw materials, specialized equipment, organized workshop production, and access to bulk markets. Lace required thread, pins, a pillow, and extraordinary manual dexterity. In a city where capital had fled and industrial organization had deteriorated, lace offered a form of production that the available workforce could sustain without the organizational requirements of the industry. It partially replaced. The economics were modest, the skill was real, and the women who practiced it across the 16th and 17th centuries were, without knowing it, maintaining a thread of continuity between the craft traditions of the commercial city and the heritage economy that would eventually give their art a new kind of value centuries later. The broader picture of Bruges in the 16th century was shaped by forces that made the city's already diminished circumstances considerably more difficult. The Protestant Reformation reached Flanders in the 1520s and 30s, bringing with it a violence of religious conflict that the cosmopolitan commercial city of the Golden Age had never experienced. The iconoclasm of 1566. When Calvinist groups moved through Flemish cities destroying devotional art and objects in churches, struck Bruges as it struck every major city in the Low Countries. The losses in Bruges from this episode were significant, though complete documentation of what was destroyed does not survive, as is generally the case for events of this kind. Centuries of accumulated religious art, carved altarpieces, painted panels, and sculpted devotional objects that the merchants of the Golden Age had commissioned, were destroyed in days or weeks. What survived did so because of individual acts of concealment and protection by people who understood what was being lost and tried to save what they could. The Spanish Habsburg administration that controlled the southern Low Countries through the late 16th century imposed its own forms of disruption. The military campaigns to suppress Protestant resistance in the 1560s and 1570s brought violence and economic disruption to Flanders in ways that accelerated the already severe demographic and commercial decline. The population of Bruges fell further. The fall of Antwerp to Spanish forces in 1585, and the subsequent closure of the Scheldt estuary to trade by the Dutch Republic, reorganized the commercial geography of the Low Countries once again. But the beneficiary of Antwerp's disruption was not Bruges, it was Amsterdam, whose harbour was accessible and whose political culture was compatible with the commercial networks that the Spanish wars had disrupted in the south. Bruges watched from a distance as the commercial energy of northern Europe reorganized itself around Amsterdam and the Dutch Golden Age. The city had no meaningful role in that reorganization. It was, by that point, a quiet city in the Spanish Netherlands, its population perhaps a third of what it had been at its medieval peak, its canals still functioning but carrying a fraction of their former traffic, its great buildings maintained or allowed to decay in proportion to the resources available. The religious institutions that had expanded into the spaces commerce had vacated became the dominant institutions of the city in ways they had never been when Bruges was focused on trade. The Beguinage of Bruges, the Ten Wijngaarden, had been founded in the 13th century. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, as the commercial city contracted, it expanded, the enclosed community of Beguines, living their ordered religious life within a walled precinct near the Minnewater at the southern edge of the old city, became one of the defining institutions of the post-commercial city. The Beguines maintained their buildings with the careful economy of people who had modest resources and permanent responsibilities. They repaired what needed repairing. They maintained what could be maintained. They did not demolish what was functional, simply because something newer might have been preferable, because something newer could not be afforded. The béguinage that visitors walk through today, its whitewashed houses arranged around a central green, its atmosphere of enclosed tranquility, survives in the form it takes because the women who lived there across 4 centuries had neither the reason nor the means to substantially change it. This pattern, the religious institution as inadvertent preservationist, was repeated across the city. Augustinian friars maintaining their church, Carmelites occupying their convent, the various confraternities and charitable foundations that managed the hospitals and almshouses that a declining city needed more, not less, as poverty increased with the retreat of commercial prosperity. None of these institutions were preserving Bruges in any conscious sense. They were simply living in it, maintaining what they used, leaving alone what they did not need. The 17th century brought its own quiet continuities. The painter Jacob van Oost the Elder produced work of genuine quality in the city during this period. The architecture of the Baroque era left its mark on some of the churches, but these were the activities of a provincial city finding what dignity it could within reduced circumstances. The Austrian period, which began in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht that transferred the southern Low Countries from Spanish to Austrian control, brought a degree of administrative modernization and relative stability. The Emperor Joseph II, whose reform program in the 1780s attempted to modernize the administrative and religious life of his territories, provoked resistance in the Austrian Netherlands in 1789 that briefly established an independent state before Austrian authority was restored. Bruges was part of this turbulence without being at its centre. The city had learned, through 3 centuries of political subordination, to one great power after another, a kind of pragmatic accommodation with whoever happened to be in authority. By 1800, Bruges was a city of somewhere around 50,000 people. Having recovered somewhat from its lowest point of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it was a city of lace-makers and religious institutions, of modest trade and provincial administration, of great buildings maintained with varying degrees of success, and a canal system that still functioned. What it was also, though no one looking at it in 1800 could have fully recognized this, was one of the most intact medieval urban environments in Europe. The buildings that the merchants of 1300 had built were still standing. The street plan that the commercial city had established was still the street plan. The canals were still the canals. The belfry still rose above the market square. The great churches, damaged but not destroyed by the iconoclasm of the 16th century, still defined the skyline. Bruges had been bypassed by the forces that had rebuilt many other major cities in northern Europe. And in being bypassed, it had kept something that those rebuilt cities had lost. The world was about to notice, and when it did, it would discover that the silence of 300 years had been, against all expectation, a form of grace. Chapter 9. The Dead City, the Novel, and the Discovery of What Was Lost. A Belgian writer named Georges Rodenbach grew up in Flemish towns whose quiet, slow rhythms left a permanent mark on his imagination, with periods spent in Bruges itself during his early years. By the late 1880s, he had moved to Paris to pursue a literary career within the heart of the French symbolist movement, working as a journalist for a Brussels newspaper while building his reputation as a poet and novelist. It was from that vantage point, settled in one of the busiest capitals in Europe, that he returned to Bruges and saw it with new eyes. What he found there, in the stillness of the canals and the silence of the streets, and the way the medieval buildings reflected themselves in the water on overcast afternoons, would produce one of the most influential works of Belgian literature, and would change how the educated world of late 19th century Europe understood this city. He walked the canals, he visited the churches, he sat in the squares, and he perceived, with the sensitivity of a writer trained to notice what other people pass by, something that the residents of the city experienced as ordinary life and that he experienced as something closer to a revelation. The city had stopped, not recently, long ago, and in stopping, it had preserved a quality of atmosphere, a density of historical time layered into the physical fabric of the streets and buildings, that the modernizing cities of industrial Europe had lost and could not recover. Paris had Haussmann's Boulevard. Brussels was rebuilding itself in the image of a prosperous, modern capital. London was a vast industrial metropolis whose medieval fabric existed only in isolated fragments. Bruges had its medieval fabric intact, its silence intact, and the particular quality of melancholy beauty that came from a place that had been great and had, slowly and without catastrophe, ceased to be. His novel Bruges la Morte, published in 1892, used the city as more than a setting. It made the city a character. The widower protagonist Hugues Vian comes to Bruges following the death of his wife, drawn to the city because its silence and its stillness seem to mirror his own grief. The canals, the empty streets, the medieval buildings, the way the city seems to exist outside of ordinary time, all of these are not backgrounds for the story. They are the story, as much as the human characters who move through them. What was distinctive about the novel, and what gave it an unusual documentary authority, was Rodenbach's decision to include photographs of Bruges in the original published edition. Real photographs of real streets and canals and buildings, inserted into a work of fiction, as if to say, this is not invented. This place exists. You can go there and find it exactly as I have described it. The photographs were a form of guarantee, a promise to the reader that the atmosphere the novel evoked was grounded in something that could be visited and verified. The book was an immediate success across Europe. It was read in France and Germany and England with the enthusiasm that late 19th century readers reserved for work that captured something they felt but had not previously had words for. Rodenbach had given a name and a form to a particular kind of aesthetic experience, the encounter with a place where the modern world had not yet arrived, where the accumulation of centuries was visible in the physical fabric of streets and buildings, rather than buried under successive layers of rebuilding. That experience was becoming increasingly rare in an industrializing Europe. The cities that had been transformed by railways and factories had lost, along with their medieval fabric, the quality of atmospheric stillness that Rodenbach was describing. Bruges had that quality precisely because it had been too poor and too commercially irrelevant to modernize. The poverty that had felt like failure to the inhabitants of the declining city was being perceived by cultivated visitors from the prosperous cities of industrial Europe as a form of grace. The artists and writers who arrived in Bruges following the novel's success were not simply tourists. They were people who found in the city a working environment of a kind that their own rapidly changing cities could no longer provide. The city that had once attracted Van Eyck and Memling to paint the material world of commercial civilization at its height was attracting artists again, now to paint the melancholy beauty of commercial civilization at its most complete point of abandonment. The romantic discovery of Bruges also created economic opportunities that the city had not had for generations. Visitors who came to experience the atmosphere spent money. Hotels opened, restaurants expanded, the lace industry, still practiced by women in the tradition of the unnamed craftswomen of the 16th century, found new markets among tourists who wanted to take home something authentically Flemish. The scholarly dimension of this rediscovery was equally important. Research published in the second half of the 19th century established the art-historical significance of the Flemish primitive painters and the medieval architecture of the city within the framework of serious academic scholarship. This work gave the aesthetic appreciation of Bruges an intellectual foundation, establishing a language through which educated people across Europe could understand what made Bruges significant in historical as well as atmospheric terms. What this dual rediscovery implied was a question that the city had not previously been required to answer. If Bruges possessed something of exceptional historical value that existed nowhere else in this form, what obligations did that possession create? And what should happen to a city when its primary value to the outside world is its past? These questions did not have obvious answers in the 1890s. The institutional frameworks that would eventually give formal expression to the concept of heritage were still being developed. The very idea that a city could be valued and managed primarily as a historical artifact rather than as a living economic organism was genuinely new. But the practical pressures were already creating a tension that would not be resolved easily. Because just as the Romantics were discovering the beauty of the silent canals, the Belgian government was addressing the economic problem that the silence represented. Bruges was a city with a history of maritime commerce and a population that needed economic opportunities. The argument that the city should be reconnected to the sea through a new canal, bypassing the silted Zwin and creating a direct link to the North Sea coast, was both economically logical and politically supported. The Boudewijn Canal, connecting Bruges to the purpose-built port of Zeebrugge on the North Sea coast, was completed in 1907. It was an engineering achievement of considerable scale and a statement of economic ambition for a city that had spent 4 centuries in commercial stagnation. The new port at Zeebrugge would grow through the 20th century into one of the major container ports of northern Europe. But the canal and the port also created a question that Bruges had not previously been required to answer explicitly. The city could pursue the industrial and commercial development that the new maritime connection made possible, or it could protect the medieval character that 4 centuries of poverty had accidentally preserved. Fully committing to both at once was not possible. That question would be answered not in a single decision, but through hundreds of smaller ones, across a century of war and recovery and transformation that no one standing in Bruges in 1907 could have anticipated. The world that was coming would test what the city valued most, and it would test it in ways that would make the silting of the Zwin look, by comparison, almost gentle. Chapter 10. 2 Wars and the Luck that was not entirely luck. Consider a woman who makes and sells lace from a small shop near the Groningen Museum in Bruges. In the autumn of 1914, this is a composite figure, assembled from what the historical record shows about civilian life in occupied Bruges during the First World War. Not a documented individual. She has inherited the shop from her mother and her grandmother before her, the craft she practices, the same bobbin lace that women in this city have been making since the 16th century, connects her to the long, quiet continuity of the post-commercial city. On the morning that German forces enter Bruges in October 1914, she watches from her window as soldiers move through streets her family has known for generations. The canal outside reflects grey autumn light. The buildings on the opposite bank are unchanged. The world that has just arrived in her city is unlike anything those buildings were designed to witness. That experience, the experience of occupation coming to a city whose physical character belongs to a world 5 centuries removed from the one being fought over, captures something essential about Bruges in the 20th century. The Western Front, that line of trenches and wire and mud that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, ran directly through the heart of Flanders. The landscape that had nurtured the medieval cloth trade, the flat agricultural plains and gentle waterways of West Flanders, became some of the most intensively fought-over terrain in human history. The names that appear in the poetry and the letters and the military histories of the period, Ypres, Passchendaele, the Menin Road, Messines, are all within 30 miles of Bruges. Ypres, a city of comparable medieval significance to Bruges, one of the great cloth-producing centres of Flanders at the same period when Bruges was at its commercial height, was essentially destroyed. The Cloth Hall of Ypres, one of the finest examples of medieval civic architecture in Europe, was reduced to rubble by artillery bombardment. The medieval city was obliterated so completely that what stands in Ypres today is a post-war reconstruction, rebuilt stone by stone with a fidelity to the original that is remarkable and slightly haunting. It looks right. It is not the thing itself. Bruges did not share this fate. The German forces that occupied the city from October 1914 used the canal system as a submarine base, constructing facilities from which U-boats operated in the North Sea and the English Channel. This gave the city a military significance it would not otherwise have had, and it made the dock areas a target for Allied bombing raids that caused damage in those zones. The civilian population of Bruges lived through 4 years of occupation that was, by any measure, a damaging experience. But the historic centre survived the First World War in substantially intact form. And the reason connects directly to the economic history we have been following across this entire story. A city that had spent 4 centuries in commercial decline was a city without significant industrial infrastructure. It had no munitions factories, no major rail junctions of overriding strategic importance, no heavy industrial facilities that would have made its historic streets a priority target for the artillery that was destroying everything within range of the front lines. The medieval city that poverty had preserved through the 16th and 17th centuries was now, by that same structural logic, being preserved by its distance from the requirements of industrial warfare. This is not a complete explanation, and it is worth being precise about this. Occupation brought serious damage to civilian life, to the economy, and to the cultural fabric of the city in ways that the physical survival of the buildings does not fully reflect. But when liberation came in October 1918, the medieval centre was recognisably intact. The interwar period brought Bruges renewed attention. Tourism resumed and grew. The restoration and conservation work that had begun in the 19th century continued with growing sophistication. The city was increasingly recognised at an international level as possessing something of exceptional value. Then, September 1939 brought the Second World War, and Belgium found itself once again in the path of a catastrophic conflict. The German invasion of May 1940 moved with a speed that the Allied forces had not anticipated. Belgium was occupied within weeks. Consider now the same lace shop near the Groninger Museum, 26 years later, perhaps still run by the same woman, now older, or by her daughter, who learned the craft at her mother's side in the years between the wars. In May 1940, German forces move through the same streets again. The canal reflects the same grey light. The buildings on the opposite bank are the same buildings, but the weight of a second occupation within living memory, the recognition that the cycle is repeating, gives the experience a quality of exhaustion and disbelief that the first occupation did not have. The port of Zeebrugge, connected to Bruges by the canal completed in 1907, had significant military importance during the Second World War. An Allied bombing of the naval installations in the area caused damage in the surrounding zones. But the historic centre of Bruges survived the Second World War in substantially intact form, for the same structural reasons that had protected it in the first conflict. A city that had never fully industrialized had no industrial infrastructure to attract the kind of strategic bombing that destroyed historic urban environments across occupied Europe. On the 12th of September 1944, forces of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division entered Bruges and liberated the city from nearly 5 years of German occupation. The moment was remembered by those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The relationship between Bruges and Canada, grounded in this specific historical act, has remained genuinely warm in the decades since. Canadians who visit Bruges today encounter a recognition that reflects something real about how the city understands its own recent history. When liberation came, Bruges emerged from 6 years of war with its medieval centre intact. The human cost of occupation was real and lasting. The physical fabric of the historic city had survived 2 of the most destructive conflicts in human history. Here is the point that deserves to be stated clearly. The survival of Bruges through 2 world wars was not simply good fortune, though fortune played its part. It was a structural consequence of the economic history of the city. A city that had never fully industrialized had no industrial infrastructure to attract strategic bombing. A city that had been commercially marginal for 4 centuries was militarily marginal in a war fought partly around industrial capacity. The same commercial failure that had accidentally preserved the medieval fabric in the 16th century was, in a different way, helping to preserve it in the 20th. The poverty that had looked like failure for so long had become, over and over again, and in circumstances that no one could have planned, a form of protection. What Bruges emerged with in 1944 was a medieval urban landscape that had survived, through a combination of economic decline, institutional inertia, relative military irrelevance, and the accumulated decisions of thousands of individuals who maintained what existed rather than replacing it, in a form that existed nowhere else in Northern Europe in the same degree of completeness. The question of what to do with that survival was about to become one of the most interesting and most difficult questions the city had ever faced. More difficult, in some ways, than the silting of the Zwin, because this time the threat would not come from absence, it would come from success. Chapter 11. 8 million visitors and the paradox of being too beautiful. On the 25th of November, in the year 2000, the historic centre of Bruges was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The inscription was the formal international recognition of something that visitors, scholars, and the city itself had understood for at least a century. Bruges possessed a medieval urban environment of a completeness and integrity that existed nowhere else in Northern Europe. The combination of the canal system, the Gothic civic architecture, the collection of Flemish primitive paintings in the Groningen Museum, and the overall coherence of the historic streetscape constituted, in UNESCO's language, a cultural heritage of outstanding universal value. The designation was a moment of genuine pride for the city. It was also the moment at which a tension that had been building for decades became impossible to ignore. Because the same qualities that made Bruges worthy of UNESCO designation, its completeness, its atmospheric stillness, its appearance of having been preserved at some point between the medieval past and the modern present, were exactly the qualities that made it attractive to the millions of tourists who were, by the early years of the 21st century, arriving in a city of approximately 120,000 residents every year. According to Visit Bruges, the city's official tourism authority, Bruges receives somewhere around 8 million day and overnight visitors annually to its historic centre. 8 million visitors in a city of approximately 120,000 people. That ratio, roughly 66 tourists for every resident, is not a statistic that describes a comfortable situation. It describes a city under a form of pressure that has no obvious historical precedent. To understand what this means in practice, consider a woman named Clara, a schoolteacher who has lived her entire life in the historic centre. This is a composite figure representing a documented pattern of experience among long-term residents of the UNESCO zone, not a specific individual. Her situation reflects what urban researchers and city planners have documented repeatedly in studies of heritage tourism pressure in Bruges. Clara's family has owned their house on one of the canal-facing streets for 3 generations. When she was a child, her neighbours were a butcher, a pharmacist, a family who ran a small printing business, and an elderly couple who had lived in the same apartment since before the war. Today, 4 of the 6 properties on her stretch of the street are either hotels, short-term rental apartments, or souvenir shops. The butcher closed 8 years ago. The pharmacy relocated to a neighbourhood outside the UNESCO zone where rents were lower. On a summer Saturday, she cannot walk to the market square in under 20 minutes because of the density of tourists moving through the streets. She has learned to do her weekly shopping on Thursday mornings, before the weekend influx begins. She has watched the price of the apartment above hers triple in 10 years as the owner converted it to tourist accommodation. She has thought about leaving. She has not yet left, partly because this is her city, and partly because she does not know where she would go that would feel like home in the same way. Her experience is not unique. It is, as urban researchers studying heritage tourism in European cities have documented, a recognizable pattern. The risk that successful preservation poses to the thing it preserves is one of the genuine paradoxes of heritage management. And Bruges illustrates it with unusual clarity, precisely because the preserved environment is so complete and so compelling. The dynamic works like this. The more perfect the preservation, the more people want to see it. The more people want to see it, the more the economic life of the place reorganizes itself around that desire. The more the economic life reorganizes itself around tourism, the more the authentic residential community that gives the place its living character is gradually displaced. And the more that community is displaced, the more the place becomes exactly the kind of dead city that Rodenbach's novel described. But dead in a new way. Not the melancholy stillness of economic decline, the bustling emptiness of a place that exists primarily to be looked at. The sociologist Ruth Glass coined the word gentrification in 1964 to describe the displacement of working-class communities in London by middle-class newcomers. Bruges is experiencing a variant of this process, in which the displacing force is not a different class of residents, but the tourism economy itself. The result is similar. People whose families have lived in the historic centre for generations find themselves in a neighbourhood that is becoming progressively less organised around their needs and more organised around the needs of people who will be there for 2 days and then leave. The city government of Bruges has been grappling with this dynamic for years, with planning policies, tourist management strategies, and community engagement initiatives that reflect a genuine attempt to maintain the historic centre as a living city rather than a heritage product. Policies that reserve certain properties for long-term residential use rather than tourist accommodation, that require new developments to include affordable housing components, are being explored and in some cases implemented. But the fundamental economic pressure is not something that planning policy alone can resolve. The lace industry, still practiced by artisans in the historic centre, illustrates a different dimension of the same dynamic. the same craft that unnamed women practiced in the 16th century as a means of economic survival, because the commercial city had collapsed and lace was one of the few things they could make and sell, is now practiced partly as a demonstration for visitors who want to see what authentic medieval craft looks like. The craft survived. The economic conditions that originally sustained it did not. What kept it alive was the tourism economy that replaced those conditions. That is not a simple story of loss. It is a complicated story about how traditions persist when their original context disappears. The irony, when you hold the full history in your mind, is sharp enough to cut. Bruges survived the silting of its harbour and the departure of its merchants and the violence of 2 world wars. The thing that now threatens to hollow it out is its own beauty and the millions of people who come each year to experience it. The city that was preserved by being forgotten is now at risk of being emptied by being remembered too enthusiastically. Chapter 12. Bruges in 2026, and the question a frozen city must ask. Stand on the Rosenhoed-Kai on a clear morning in early spring, before the tourist coaches arrive, before the chocolate shops open their doors, before the first canal boats begin their circuits. The water is still. The reflections of the stepped gable facades on the opposite bank are almost perfect, broken only by the occasional movement of a coot navigating between the reeds at the water's edge. The belfry is visible above the roofline to the north, its upper section catching the first light of a morning that comes slowly at this time of year in this part of Europe. The air smells of the canal and the damp stone, and something that is simply the smell of old cities in the early morning. A combination of history and cold air, and the particular quality of a place that has absorbed an extraordinary amount of human time. In this moment, before the crowds arrive, the city does not feel like a museum. It does not feel like a heritage product or a theme park or any of the slightly diminishing terms that modern urban discourse reaches for when it wants to describe a place valued primarily for what it was. It feels like something else, like a place that has survived so much, and for such unexpected reasons, that its continued existence is itself a kind of argument, not for anything in particular, just for the stubborn persistence of things that refuse to disappear when the logic of history suggests they should have. Bruges in 2026 is a city of approximately 120,000 people in the municipality. It is the capital of the West Flanders province and a significant urban centre in the Flemish region of Belgium. Its economy combines the heritage tourism that has become its most visible characteristic with a port sector centred on Zeebrugge that makes it, by cargo volume, one of the more significant maritime gateways of northern Europe. The contradiction between the medieval city that tourists come to experience and the modern industrial port a few miles to the northwest is one that Bruges has learned to live with, maintaining 2 identities that have almost nothing to do with each other and that the city manages, with varying degrees of success, to keep in separate compartments. The physical condition of the historic centre is, by the standards that matter for a UNESCO World Heritage Site, generally well maintained. The major monuments, the belfry, the Church of Our Lady, the Basilica of the Holy Blood, the City Hall on the Berg, the Groningen Museum with its collection of Flemish primitive paintings, are maintained with the resources that their significance justifies. The canal system, first developed by the medieval city and extended over generations of merchants, guilds, and municipal authorities, is functioning today under the careful management of a city administration whose priority is heritage preservation rather than commercial throughput, a use that the original builders of these waterways would have found almost unrecognizable. The questions that the city faces in 2026 are not primarily questions about the condition of individual monuments. They are questions about sustainability in a broader sense. The climate question is not abstract for a city built on medieval foundations in a low-lying coastal region. The North Sea coastline of Belgium is among the areas of Europe most directly exposed to the consequences of rising sea levels and the increased frequency of storm surge events that current climate projections anticipate through the Belgium 21st century. The medieval builders who constructed Bruges on slightly elevated ground above the surrounding marsh made their engineering calculations based on sea level conditions that are no longer stable. The flood defences that protect the Belgian coast are being assessed and upgraded in light of projections that were not available to the engineers who originally built them. The specific vulnerability of Bruges relates not just to flooding, but to the condition of the foundations on which its medieval buildings stand. Many of the historic structures of the city are built on wooden piles driven into the soft ground beneath, a construction method common throughout the Low Countries for buildings in waterlogged terrain. Those piles have remained structurally sound for centuries because they have been continuously submerged in groundwater, which prevents the biological decay that would otherwise destroy them. Changes in groundwater levels, from extraction, climate effects, or changes in drainage patterns, can expose those piles to air and accelerate decay in ways that threaten the structural integrity of the buildings above them. This is a known vulnerability of medieval construction in this type of terrain, monitored by the city's conservation specialists with considerable attention. The housing question is one the city government has identified as a priority concern. The situation that Clara represents is not an isolated individual experience. It is a systemic pattern that the city is attempting to address through planning policy, though the economic forces driving it are larger than any single municipal authority can fully counter. The cultural question may be the most interesting one, and the hardest to reduce to a policy framework. What does it mean to live in a city that the outside world values primarily as a historical artifact? How do the people of Bruges, the students and the families and the people who were born here and who chose to stay, relate to a past that is simultaneously their inheritance and their city's primary commercial product? The young people of Bruges are growing up in a city that the world values precisely for what it was, rather than what it is becoming. The medieval guild houses and the Flemish primitive paintings and the canal reflections that appear on the accounts of millions of visitors every year are not the daily experience of the teenager going to school in Bruges in 2026. They are the backdrop of that experience, present but not necessarily felt as the defining reality of contemporary life. And yet, the city that froze is not simply a museum. It is a place where people are being born and going to school and falling in love and arguing about local politics and deciding what to do with their lives. The belfry still rings its bells on the hour, the same function it has performed since the 13th century, measuring time in a city where time has always had a particular quality. The canal boats still move through the waterways that medieval engineers dug for entirely commercial reasons. The Church of Our Lady still contains the Michelangelo Madonna that a Bruges cloth merchant named Jan Mauskron purchased in the early 16th century as a gesture of faith, one of the few works by that artist to leave Italy during his lifetime. Its presence here, a direct consequence of the commercial wealth that the city's medieval trade generated. The Beguinage is still inhabited by Benedictine nuns who maintain, in their enclosed precinct near the Minueta, the kind of ordered community that the Beguines established 8 centuries ago. History here is not only in the past, it is in the present tense. This is what makes Bruges, finally, something more than a beautiful relic. What makes it worth the journey, and worth the time we have spent with its story. The city was built by people who needed a landing stage in a marsh. It was enriched by merchants who understood that wool and cloth and the financial instruments that moved value across long distances were reshaping the world around them. It developed a gathering place for commercial exchange whose name travelled, through the word bourse, into many of the financial markets of the modern world. It organised craftsmen who defeated armoured cavalry on a muddy field and hung the Golden Spurs on a church wall as a statement about who had the right to defend what they had built. It commissioned a painter to look at the material world of commercial prosperity with a precision that the 5 centuries since have not surpassed. It was abandoned by its harbour, preserved by its poverty, discovered by its melancholy, survived 2 world wars by the structural consequence of never having fully industrialized, and was inscribed on a heritage list that now makes it one of the most visited places in Northern Europe. Every single one of those outcomes was unplanned. Every single one was the consequence of forces that the people living through them did not fully understand and could not have predicted. The medieval canal system was not built to be beautiful. It was built to move goods. The guild houses were not built to be photographed. They were built to conduct business. The belfry was not built to appear in travel guides. It was built to ring bells that told workers when their shifts began and when they ended. Every beautiful thing in Bruges was built for a practical reason by people who were thinking about commerce and defence and worship, not about the visitors of the 21st century. And this is what the city teaches. If you spend enough time with its history to hear what it is saying beneath the surface, the most enduring things are not the ones made to be permanent. They are the ones that survived by accident, by circumstance, by the particular combination of poverty and geography and the quiet persistence of people who maintained what existed because replacing it was beyond their means. Bruges was supposed to be just another medieval city that modernized and moved on and became something new, the way Antwerp and Amsterdam and many other significant cities in Northern Europe did. The harbour had other plans, and because the harbour silted up, and because the merchants left, and because there was no money to tear anything down, a city that was dying accidentally became one of the most complete medieval urban environments on the surface of the earth. That is not a comfortable story. It is not the story of vision or planning or the wisdom of those in power. It is the story of failure transformed, over centuries and through circumstances that no one controlled, into something that looks, from sufficient distance, almost like grace. The water that left Bruges took everything the city thought it needed. It left behind everything the city actually had. 500 years later, people come from every country in the world to walk beside the canals and look at what the water left. They photograph it. They write about it. They stand on the Rosenhodekai in the early morning and feel something they struggle to put into words. And they rarely stop to think about how easily a different century might have torn it down.